Michael May, and you, Lauren Garcia, for facilitating my participation in the conference today. And finally, in this tumultuous political season, I want to thank Nebraska for giving the country the gift of serious leaders like my friends Ben Sass and Jeff Fortenberry. Send us more here in the swamp. We need more of Nebraska here in Washington. How does the example and teaching of John Paul II help us navigate hard times and be the missionary disciples we were all baptized to be? Perhaps some biographical notes and a few reflections on the deepest sources of the Pope's life of faith and prayer will suggest some answers. In the years since I began working on Witness to Hope, the first volume of my John Paul II biography in the mid-1990s, I've often been asked, what did you learn about John Paul II that you didn't know before you started this project? And there are really two answers to that. The first is I learned the extraordinary importance of his father as an influence on his life. I think Karol Wojtyła Sr. was the singular influence on the life of the man who became Pope in the first 20 years of Karol Wojtyła Jr.'s life. And I learned that the Second World War was really the formative experience of his life. That the man we knew as John Paul II was decisively formed between 1939 and 1945. For Americans, the Second World War tends to reduce to something like Pearl Harbor, D-Day, and victory parades. That was not the experience of the Second World War in Poland. Poland lived a horrific experience between 1939 and 1945, as indeed did that entire part of Central and Eastern Europe that the historian Timothy Snyder has simply called the Bloodlands. 20% of the Poles who were alive in 1939 had died by 1945. 1/5 of the country either was killed outright, died of starvation, malnutrition, disease, whatever. And Poland itself was torn apart. What was then the eastern part of Poland was absorbed into the Soviet Union, thanks to the notorious Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact of 1939. So about 40% of Poland disappears to the east. A chunk of the west of Poland, including the town in which Karol Wojtyła was born, Wadowice, was incorporated into the Third Reich and actually became part of Germany. What was left, and here is where Wojtyła spent the Second World War, was the middle of Poland. It was ruled from Krakow, where he lived. It was called the General Government. It was run by a Nazi gangster named Hans Frank. And the purpose of the General Government was to finish Poland. The strategy was to feed the Poles minimal caloric diet so that they could literally be worked to death for the greater glory of the Third Reich, such that over time, they would simply die out. As Hans Frank himself put it, they will eat little, they will work much, there will never again be a Poland. This general government, this Nazi-occupied part of Poland, was a land without the rule of law. The British historian Norman Davies simply describes it as Gestapo land. It was a land without any form of public order except the order of terror. If a German army officer or a Gestapo agent or an SS officer didn't like the way you looked at him on the street, you could be shot on the spot and nothing would happen to the man who just killed you. That's an extraordinary experience. And it was summed up for me really in the early 1990s when I was working on the book, The Final Revolution, on the church's role in the collapse of communism, and was getting to know Poland in person. It was summed up for me by one of Karol Wojtyła's seminary classmates who said to me, you have to understand that it was not a question during those years of knowing whether you would be alive on your next birthday or alive at Christmas or alive at Easter. For 6 years, it was a question of not knowing whether you would be alive tomorrow morning. That's a real pressure cooker. That's an extraordinarily pressurized situation. What did these draconian circumstances in which he lived for 6 years do to Karol Wojtyła, the man who became Pope St. John Paul II? I think we might begin to understand this, to get an answer to that question, by thinking geologically before thinking theologically. Life in occupied Krakow during the Second World War, life in that Gestapo land, was somehow analogous to the pressures that exist underneath the surface of the earth. We all know that beneath the crust of the earth's surface, there are all sorts of tremendous pressures at work, titanic and destructive forces that can do enormous damage. They can create earthquakes, tsunamis, volcanic eruptions, and lethal lava flows. But something else happens beneath the Earth's surface thanks to those pressures. Those pressures form diamonds. Diamonds are the hardest, brightest substance that we know. Diamonds can cut through things that seem impervious to being cut. Diamonds reflect light in a particularly brilliant way. I think we can begin to understand what happened to Karol Wojtyła during that formative experience of the Second World War by saying that he became a kind of human diamond. Under circumstances far, far more difficult than anything we confront today, he became a kind of human diamond. Over time, he became the kind of diamond that could cut through the seemingly impenetrable, like the Berlin Wall. Like a diamond, he could reflect light, the divine light, in a singularly brilliant way. Andrei Sakharov's wife, Elena Bonner, not a believer, once came out of a meeting with John Paul II and said to a friend of hers, "He's the most remarkable man I've ever met. He's all light. He is a source of light." That's what happened to Karol Wojtyła during the Second World War, or that's what resulted, I believe, from his experience of the Second World War. But that experience had to be understood, had to be processed, if you will, theologically and spiritually before he could be the kind of human diamond that we all experienced. And this brings us to thinking theologically about Wojtyła's experience as a young man. In the early days of the Second World War, of the German occupation of Krakow, the occupying German forces removed to concentration camps 6 of the 7 Salesian priests at the parish of St. Stanisław Kostka in the Debniki neighborhood of Krakow, which was Wojtyła's neighborhood and parish. The remaining priest asked a layman, a man named Jan Tyranowski, to take over in the parish what we would call today youth ministry. This was not asking a simple thing, because organized Catholic youth activities were forbidden by the occupation. And if you got caught in one of these things, you would be immediately dispatched to a concentration camp, or more likely, simply shot. Jan Tyranowski accepted and became another critical figure in the life of Karol Wojtyła. Tyranowski had only an 8th grade education. He was a tailor by trade. He worked in his family's tailoring business. But as a young man, he had become fascinated by the writings of the great Carmelite mystics of the 16th century, Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross. And after working in the morning in his family's tailoring shop, he would spend the rest of the day, the afternoon and the evening, in a program of spiritual reading, prayer, meditation, and contemplation that was at least as rigorous as anything that was happening in the monasteries or convents of Krakow at the time. And in the course of that life of contemplative prayer, Jan Tyranowski became something of an autodidact expert in Carmelite spirituality. So he's asked to take over youth ministry among young men in the parish of St. Stanisław Kostka during the Second World War. So he creates what he called living rosary groups, groups of 15 young men. There were then 15 mysteries in the full rosary, each of which group was led by a particularly mature young man who was called the animator of the group. And Karol Wojtyła was one of the first animators of one of the first living rosary groups founded by Jan Tyranowski. Tyranowski gave special counsel, spiritual direction to these living rosary animators. And he must have sensed that this literarily inclined young man, who had already been writing poetry and plays for years as a teenager, would be interested in the poetry of St. John of the Cross and the autobiography of St. Teresa of Avila. And so Tyranowski begins feeding young Wojtyła the classic spirituality of the Carmelite reform of the 16th century. And so Wojtyła becomes immersed in the spirituality of Carmel, to the point where he tries, first during the war, later immediately after the war when he's in the seminary in Krakow, to join the local Carmelite monastery. He was refused during the war because they weren't accepting new novices. And when he was in the Krakow seminary, the Archbishop Sapieha, Cardinal Sapieha, said, no, you're not going to the Carmelites. You have to finish what you began here. In any event, he tried to join the Carmelites and didn't, but that Carmelite experience under Jan Tyranowski's spiritual direction and tutelage left a lasting imprint on Karol Wojtyła, the man who became St. John Paul II. What did he learn from all of that? The first thing he learned is that the truth of history, the central truth of the human story, is found on the cross. in Jesus dying in complete self-surrender to the will of the Father, and then being vindicated in that self-emptying by the resurrection. That's the central truth of history. That's the pivot of the human story. And what is that resurrection? It's, first of all, the revelation of God's power over death itself, and it's the revelation in the risen Lord of the transfigured human condition that is the destiny of all those who embrace Christ and the cross. What the risen Christ's transfigured humanity is, so we shall be. This was the root, one root certainly, of what Professor Karol Wojtyła, philosophy teacher at the Catholic University of Lublin, would later call in his philosophical work the law of the gift, namely that self-giving, not self-assertion, is the royal road to human flourishing, to happiness, and ultimately to beatitude. In the third place, that conviction that the truth of history is found on the cross and the answer to the cross is given in the resurrection, that also led him to a life-transforming conviction in Karol Wojtyła, Pope St. John Paul II. And that conviction was that the worst in human history had already happened on Good Friday. Humanity had killed the incarnate Son of God. The worst in human history had already happened, and the answer to that had been given on Easter Sunday. Death did not have the final word. Human folly, human wickedness, human cruelty does not have the final word. And believing that, Karol Wojtyła, Pope St. John Paul II, could live not so much without fear, but beyond fear. He could live beyond fear. And believing that, so can everyone else who embraces the cross of Christ as the axial point of human history. We can live the challenge to be not afraid that rang out at John Paul II's inaugural Mass on October 22nd, 1978. This Carmelite focus on the cross as the center of human history, Good Friday and Easter Sunday, the center of human history, also helps us understand, I think, what's a fascinating and curious phenomenon. And that is John Paul II's striking ability to seem present to everyone he met. This was true one-on-one, but it was even more strikingly true when he was addressing great crowds. I can't tell you how many times men and women have told me that during those great papal visits to Poland in 1979, 1983, 1987, when he launched the revolution of conscience that eventually helped bring down European communism, he would be speaking to crowds of 200,000, 500,000, perhaps 1 million people. And each person had the sense that he was speaking to them individually, no matter how distant they were from it. There's a great story of the June 79 pilgrimage to Poland. The Pope is down in Silesia, outside of Katowice, the big coal mining area in the southwest of Poland. And he's giving this rather lengthy homily, and there are 500,000 coal miners and their families there. And one coal miner starts to say something to the guy, the coal miner standing next to him. And the guy standing next to him says, "Shut up, can't you see the Pope is talking to me?" How did that happen? How did that kind of thing happen? I think it happened because for Karol Wojtyła, John Paul II, everybody was a somebody. Everybody was a somebody for whom the Son of God, the second person of the most holy and triune God, had become incarnate, suffered, died, and been raised from the dead. So everyone is a someone of infinite dignity and value. Everyone we meet, everyone he met, was someone for whom the second person of the Blessed Trinity had become incarnate, suffered, died, and was raised from the dead. What does this reflection on papal biography, on the biography of Karol Wojtyła, John Paul II, have to do with redeeming the times in which we live, which are surely in need of redemption? What might we learn, for example, from those 9 days of his first papal pilgrimage to Poland in June 1979? Days on which, at least in retrospect, you can feel the history of the 20th century turning for a change in a positive direction. It's interesting to me, it has been interesting to me in the almost 25 years now since I've been writing about those events, that during those 9 days, in which he gave over 50 speeches of one sort or another, homilies, addresses to large crowds, addresses to specific groups, spontaneous remarks to young people. In those 50-some texts, if you will, he never discusses politics or economics once. And aside from saying hello in June, on June 2nd at the airport in Warsaw, and goodbye on June 10th at the airport in Krakow, he doesn't mention the government once. He simply talks directly to the Polish people. And what did he do? You have to understand that after that draconian Nazi occupation of Poland, which I described, there immediately followed the communist occupation of Poland. And both of those occupations had, as part of their strategy of conquest and subjugation, rewriting the history of Poland. The Nazis intended to rewrite the history of Poland by writing Poland out of history. Communists intended to rewrite the history of Poland by simply rewriting it and making it up from scratch. So for 9 days, what did the Pope do? The Pope gave back to the people of Poland the truth of their story, the truth about themselves. If you go through those 50-some texts of the June 1979 papal pilgrimage to Poland, he plays any number of variations on one great theme. And that theme is, you are not who they, in this case the communists, but in the background the Nazis, say you are. You're not who they say you are. Permit me to remind you who you really are. You are a people formed by a distinctive history, at the center of which is your Catholic faith. Poland begins with the baptism of the Piast Prince Mieszko in 966 AD. You have a unique story. If you reclaim that story, if you reclaim the truth about yourselves, if you own the truth of your history, you will find tools of resistance to tyranny that the communists cannot match. If you reclaim the truth about yourself, you will find the sources of national renewal and ultimately of national liberation. I think there's a lesson in this for us, and especially for those of us in the pro-life movement and in the movement of national renewal, that is the effort to make ours a country in which every human life from conception until natural death is welcomed in life and protected in law. What's that lesson? The lesson is this, and this is the challenge that this moment puts before us. America has lost the truth about itself. For over 200 years, the story of the United States was a story of widening and expanding the community of common conviction and concern. America freed the slaves. America enfranchised women. America did something that we take so for granted today that it seems utterly normal, but took a great effort to do, made its public spaces accessible to people with physical handicaps, all in a great process of expanding the community of common concern, the commons of America. The true American story is a story of expanding inclusion. And then comes, in January 1973, Roe versus Wade and Doe versus Bolton. And suddenly there's a great contraction. And the storyline is broken. The narrative, to use that horrible word, the narrative is shattered because Roe broke the pattern of expanding conclusion by declaring an entire class of indisputably human beings who simply happen not to have been born yet, outside the community of common concern and legal protection. And that breaking of the American story has had terrible effects ever since, because the contraction that began with Roe versus Wade has now continued. The inconvenient and burdensome elderly are now considered in some states outside the community of common concern and legal protection. And we know where this leads from the history of the 20th century. The foundation of the Nazi program of genocide and euthanasia was a scholarly idea. In the 1920s, in the Weimar Republic, Germany's first experiment with a democracy, only lasted about 13 years, there was a legal theory developed about what was called lebensunwertes Leben, life unworthy of life. This begins with the severely handicapped physically or mentally. It then expands to the gravely, burdensomely, and expensively ill, and we know where it ends with the genocide of gypsies, gay people, and ultimately German Jewry. This was not an idea created by thugs. The thugs carried out the executions, but the idea came from high culture. And that's happening to us today too. This notion of life unworthy of life, or at least life less worthy of a fully protected life, is very much part of our political culture today. And it's what underwrites Roe versus Wade, which is also underwritten by a false notion of freedom. If we look through that American story of expanding inclusion, we find a deepening of the idea of the liberty to which the founders pledged their lives, fortunes, and sacred honor. They did not understand that liberty at the founding as one of mere willfulness. They understood that freedom had a relationship to the truth about the human person that we can know by reason, and that freedom ought to be lived in goodness, in solidarity with others. What's happened to that is that over the last several generations, freedom has gotten whittled down. Freedom has shrunk in America to a matter of mere willfulness, to the point where one sometimes thinks that Frank Sinatra's song, "I Did It My Way," is the de facto national anthem rather than the Star-Spangled Banner or America the Beautiful, which talks about liberty confirmed in righteousness and lived through law. Our task is to retell America the truth of its story. Pro-life Americans are the bearers of the truth about the American story, which is not the distorted story of "I did it my way" willfulness, but a story of freedom tethered to truth, ordered to goodness, and lived in solidarity. We have to be steadfast in telling that story. It's not an easy story to tell or to offer to others in the present cultural circumstances. And we should know that telling that story will involve the cross. If we know that, however, we will not be intimidated. We can live beyond fear and intimidation, knowing that the worst in human history has already happened on Good Friday, and that God gave a definitive answer to that radical evil in the resurrection. Our country needs what Lincoln described during the Civil War as a new birth of freedom. Freedom rightly understood. Only a virtuous people can be truly free. And only a virtuous people can make the political and economic machinery of freedom work for human flourishing and the common good. That is why in the encyclical Evangelium Vitae, whose 25th anniversary we marked earlier this year, John Paul II insisted that the constitutional and legal protection of the right to life from conception until natural death was an essential building block, an essential foundation stone of any genuine democracy. And that is why he warned in both the 1991 encyclical Centesimus Annus and in Evangelium Vitae that a democracy that deludes itself into thinking that wrongs can be declared rights risks becoming a tyranny, what Benedict XVI called the dictatorship of relativism. We're living today in a deeply wounded political culture that has been wounded by false stories about the American story, wounded by false ideas of freedom, wounded by an increasingly, frankly, rancid public environment. To heal that culture and rebuild the foundations of the American democratic experiment is a task for many years. We're only in the first or second inning, if you'll permit me a baseball analogy, during the World Series. We're only in the first or second inning. It's a task for many years to rebuild the moral and cultural foundations of the country, but it must be done because we can't fix our politics without repairing our broken political culture. We cannot fix our politics without repairing our broken political culture. So, at this conference and moving forward, let's resolve to take up that task now, to give the country a new birth of freedom, rightly understood, to go about doing that beyond fear, and to place our efforts under the protection of Mary, star of the new evangelization, and St. John Paul II, who loved America and wanted it to live its noblest ideals to the benefit of the entire world. Thank you.
Thank you, George, for that great reflection on the life of St. John Paul II and a reflection on where our culture is today here in America. I have a couple questions for you, but I just want to remind everyone listening in, if you have a question to pose to George, you can type it into the chat box or into the Q&A part. If you're down at the bottom of your screen, there's bubbles that say Q&A. You can type in a question there and I will ask him. George, one thing I loved always to hear about John Paul II, and you touched on it, of course, is how he made every person feel like they were the only person in the world when he would speak to them. And I am a little bit too young, and I never had the opportunity to actually see John Paul II, but, just learning about him a lot from your works and reading his writings, I feel like I've developed a friendship. And even when I went to World Youth Day in Poland several years ago, I felt like there were times where he was speaking directly to me and showing me where to go to discover the next holy thing. But I want to ask for you to expand a little bit on this part of him, that he would be able to make anybody feel like they were the only person, that he saw everyone as loved and redeemed by Jesus. What was it? Can you talk a little bit more about that? What was it that drove that confidence in him to treat everyone like that, even to the point where he could sit with and forgive the man who tried to assassinate him? And then how can we foster that sense in ourselves as well?
I don't think, Lauren, you can understand John Paul II's way of dealing with people. His mastery of spiritual direction, for example, one of the young people he worked with when he was a university chaplain in the 1950s told me that he had mastered the art of listening. You can't understand any of that unless you understand it as resulting from his life of prayer and his faith. There's another facet of his personality that I could mention in this respect. It's somewhat related. I often have said he was the most relentlessly curious man I've ever met. He always wanted to know what was going on. What are the new books? What are the movies? What are the arguments? How is this person doing? How's that person doing? And this continued literally up to the end of his life. And some people would say, well, that's a psychological tick of somebody who was, orphaned young, had no direct relatives before his 21st birthday. I don't think that's the case. I think it was the product of his life of prayer. His most important hour every day was that hour of private prayer before his morning mass. And out of that conversation with the Lord came his conversation with others. And I think out of that came his remarkable patience with events. He did not demand immediate results. He was content to plant the seeds that he thought the great sower of seeds intended him to plant, and he didn't demand that they spring up immediately. I think this is true of many of his initiatives in the church, including his reform of the priesthood. It was certainly true of June 1979. He had no idea in June 1979 that 10 years later the Berlin Wall would come down. His job was to plant the seeds. So if you have that long-term, if you have that view that divine providence really is in charge, then you will see everyone as a someone who fits in one way or another into that divinely written script of history. And you will relax a bit about results. I mean, you won't be insouciant about results, but you'll relax a bit about results. You'll be asking yourself, I think what he asked himself every day, what is the Holy Spirit asking me to do today? What is the Lord asking me to do today? And that's a way to live vocationally. So I think those are all parts of the picture there.
So you spoke about how the times that John Paul II lived in, you know, it had to be processed so that he could become the diamond that we know him to be, that we knew him to be. So our times are a little different than the times he grew up in, of course, but they're still troubling in some ways. So what are ways that you see that we can be hopeful that the times that we're living in will help produce great leaders who will rise and defend life and, you know, do the opposite of what Roe v. Wade did, which is to expand the inclusion of life in all forms?
Well, Lauren, you're too young to remember this, but the day after Roe v. Wade was handed down, the New York Times, in its most pompous voice, if anyone in this world thinks they're infallible, it's the New York Times editorial board, simply announced the abortion argument in America is over. Well, sorry, it's not over. And in fact, it's more intense, it's deeper, and it's moving in the right direction. This is something I think particularly long-term veterans of the pro-life movement need to recognize. We have won the substantive argument. There is no serious question in any serious person's mind anymore about the science here. The product of human conception is a human being, period. There should be no argument about the first principle of justice involved here. Innocent human life deserves the protection of the law in a just society. What we now have to do is convert hearts. The conversion of hearts will make those facts of biology and those facts of ethics evident in such a way that we will eventually see a society in which everyone is welcomed in life and protected in law. Now, we got a lot working against us. We've got a national media that is almost willfully ignorant about some of these matters. We have tragically one political party that is now locked into the most extreme understanding of the abortion license, and we have to try to change that. But if you look, I'm not big on polling data because I think most polling questions are pretty stupid. But I think there is an increasing sense in the country that we are becoming coarser, colder, less a people of solidarity because of the abortion license. And here, as we have to say, whenever the pro-life community gathers, aid to women in crisis pregnancies, aid to the elderly at the end of their lives. These are essential components of pro-life work. The crisis pregnancy clinics and centers that we support are every bit as important in the pro-life movement as arguments. I remember years ago, I gave the altar call, which was really a fundraising call at the annual dinner of a wonderful crisis pregnancy center in Chicago called Aid for Women. It's the only crisis pregnancy center in downtown Chicago. And I gave what I thought was a pretty good rabble-rousing speech and getting people ready to open their checkbooks and whatnot. And then they bring up at the end this, if I may say, rather overweight lady and her little baby. And she just wants to thank everybody because she had found herself unexpectedly pregnant, had walked into Aid for Women, thinking it was an abortuary, had been counseled to bear the child, and she just wanted to thank everybody for supported Aid for Women for helping her have her baby. Well, the place went nuts. And I said to the people who brought me out, you didn't need me? This is the only thing you need here. This is so much more powerful than anything I could say. So let us always remember that the witness of these crisis pregnancy centers and why we have to keep them protected legally is an essential part of the work. And that goes true for hospice care at the other end of the life spectrum. These are very, very important tangible expressions of the kind of conversion of hearts that will then let us bring to bear the fact that we've in fact won the substantive argument.
Absolutely. Those stories are always very powerful. And I know there's a lot of people participating in our webinar today that help with these crisis pregnancy centers and volunteers. So just a shout out to all of those pro-life coordinators and pro-life leaders who are doing that great work. So last question, I think here, you talked about redeeming the political culture. So we, as Americans, need to tell the story of America. We need to work to redeem that political culture. So what can Joe Schmo do? Not an elected official, not anybody who thinks they have much influence. What can they do? And then just a question from the audience here. Does law follow culture or culture follow law? I think that can all be fit in one.
Well, I'll give a cheesy answer to the last. It's both. Law obviously shapes culture, but culture makes law possible for good or ill. I mean, what changed in America such that the 1964 Civil Rights Act could have been adopted? What changed was hearts. It was the witness of the civil rights movement from its classic period, from the early 1950s to the early 1960s. I believe, for example, that Jackie Robinson, the great number 42 of the Brooklyn Dodgers, had as much to do with putting America on the right track to desegregation as Martin Luther King. Hearts and minds are changed and laws follow, and then those laws hopefully deepen that change. We have got a great work of, as I said in my remarks, retelling the American story. the kind of nonsense that's being promoted today by this 1619 project of the New York Times. America really begins when the first slave ships arrived at Jamestown, Virginia, and similar acts of really grotesquely ideologically distorted history telling. They have to be resisted. And you can't beat something with nothing. So the way to beat false stories is with true stories. There is a wonderful new book, maybe just about 9-10 months, year old now, history of the United States, called Land of Hope, The Great American Story, by my friend Bill McClay, Professor Wilfred McClay of the University of Oklahoma. Every parent should get that book and make sure their kids have read it by the time they finish high school. Grandparents can do the same. You can't beat something with nothing. Make sure that your school districts adopt Land of Hope instead of some nonsensical American history textbook. Certainly this should be easy to do in our Catholic school system. But the only way to beat the false story is with the true story. And Bill McClay's book is not a whitewash. It takes very seriously the flaws, faults, and defaults of America not living up to its noblest ideals. But it does not deny those ideals. It lifts them up and says these are the real drivers of the story over time. So that's one thing that comes to mind to me. This is a very urgent work within school districts, within Catholic schools, because a lot of this nonsense that we have seen over the last 7 months is the product of a corrupt public education system. And that has got to be resisted, both on the issues that primarily concern this conference, but also on this broader question of renewing the national political culture. So Land of Hope by Wilfred McClay is a good place to start.
Thank you. And, bringing to mind education's why the issue of school choice is so important. I know you agree, you've written very wonderfully about that, but that also giving kids and parents the opportunity to send their kids places where that story will be told.
Inner city Catholic schools are the greatest anti-poverty program that the Catholic Church in the United States has ever developed. And we have to find a way to maintain that. I think that's just the simple empirical fact of the matter. And they're doing a great service, not simply to the Catholic community, but to the parents, non-Catholic parents of children who want something better for their kids than these failing government-run schools.
Absolutely. Well, George, our time with you is up. Thank you so much for being with us today. We hope, as you said, that you will be in person with us soon. Just to remind you all of the book that he mentioned was Land of Hope by Wilfred McClay. And then we'll also just plug George's latest book, The Next Pope, and all of his works, really, especially those on John Paul II. Yes, go ahead.
Let us mention the subtitle because there are 2 books called The Next Pope.
Oh, yes.
They're quite different.
Go ahead.
The Next Pope, The Office of Peter, and A Church in Mission. Those of you who labored through Witness to Hope will be glad to know it's only 141 pages long. You can read it in an hour and a half.
Excellent. Well, thank you, George, so much. For all of you sticking around, we're going to just take a 5-minute break, blink a little bit, get away from your screen and run to the restroom. And we're going to come back with Marion Miner. He is our Associate Director for Pro-Life and Family. He's going to be talking about Roe v. Wade. So George gave us a little bit of a primer. Roe v. Wade and redeeming the law. So practically, how can we move from Roe v. Wade? What are the things that we can do to use the law to help protect unborn life and all life? So stick around. We're going to just take a 5-minute break and we'll be back. Thank you, George, so much.
Thank you.
I'm just gonna put this here while we wait. all through that.
Yes, well,
I hope you're all laughing along with George. For those of you wondering, yes, at the beginning we explained this, but there was a change to the schedule. I know the talk says it starts at noon, but we are going to just go ahead and go right into the next talk, Marion's talk, starting here in a few minutes. We tried to make it possible to do small groups, but it became a little tricky. So sorry about that change. And of course, we're going to be recording these talks. So if you plan on coming back at noon and now you can't, we're going to be sending these talks out. So you'll be able to watch it later. Sorry about the change of schedule.